So good morning, everyone. So sorry about that. Good morning, everyone. My name is Olivia Warren. I'm with the Coalition for the Delaware River Watershed. And this is the intersection of public health, equity, and restoration session. So before we get in with our fabulous presenters, I just have a few housekeeping notes for everyone. So this session is being recorded and will be shared sometime in the next few weeks on the Coalition's website. All of the attendees are muted by the host, so if you'd like to share your thoughts, please use the chat box. If you're having any technical issues, please message me, Olivia Warren, directly, and I will do my best to help you out. And the rest of the forum program can be found on the link Delaware River Watershed Forum.skeg.com, and I can add that in the chat at the end of this session so you know where you can go after this. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rhonda Chapman, who will be moderating today's session.
Great. Thank you so much, Olivia. Good morning, everyone. I'm coming to you from the not so sunny, smoky, hazy Richmond, California. My name is Rhonda Chapman, and I'm a senior associate with the Policy Link organization, where I serve as our organization lead on water and climate resilience. We're going to be joined today by Berenice Tompkins. She's with Jersey Renews campaign. She's an organizer, and she also serves on the New Jersey Work Environmental Council. And we're also going to be learning from Benita Hussein, who is the director of the Trust for Public Lands 10-Minute Walk program. So we're looking forward to having this conversation with you. We hope everybody has a pen and a piece of paper ready to take notes about the resources you're going to learn. Olivia, next slide. So we thought it would be helpful for you to have a sense of what you can expect from us. You're going to have a better understanding about the crises that we're in and the compounding nature of climate change and the pandemic's economic costs and how they must be addressed together. We're going to learn about the benefits of a just transition, why equitable park access is so critical, ways to achieve equitable processes and outcomes, and we'll also be able to share some resources that can catalyze some action. So first, I'd love for us to get started with an important practice. And this is not meant to be something that is a tokenizing exchange, but as we think about where we are, as we look at climate change, as we look at our health, as we look at economic investments, it's really important for us to also realize the land that we're sitting on. And so Olivia has put in the chat room, if everybody here can open that up, there is a link. And I want everybody to go click on that link, and I'm going to do it too, even though I know the answer. And we're going to take just a few minutes for folks to recognize the land that you're currently sitting on, whether you're zooming in from your home, whether you're zooming in from another place that you're working remotely from with a loved one. It's really important for you to know where you are. And so what I'd like for everybody to do is open the link, click on Go to Map. Right now, we're just going to look at the territories. So you'll see on the left-hand side, there is a window for you to click on Search. And I want you all to type in the address of where you are. And hopefully you see that, and you'll see the camera will zoom in. And there you will find the names of the territories upon which you're sitting. Olivia is super awesome. She's doing it live so you all can see what it looks like. And I just want to invite folks to, now is not really the time. We didn't have the session designed for that, but I really want to invite folks to look at those names and familiarize yourselves with the history, and then also familiarize yourself with the current political conditions that exist for these people, these Indigenous, these First Nations folks that have been on this land that we occupy. And I wanted to invite us to do this because as we think about equity, very often we think about it in terms of Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. And we think about it in terms of the various oppressions that many of us have been living through for generations, generation after generation, and some of them are going to continue to persist. So we're going to learn a little bit of some strategies that we can apply to address some of those inequities today. So if you haven't done so, the link is in the chat box. Feel free to do it on your own time, but just wanted to invite that as a practice for folks to consider moving forward. Thanks, Olivia. You can go on to the next. And so first we're going to hear from Berenice Tompkins. And Berenice, take it away.
Hi, thank you so much. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for starting us off, Rhonda. I think that's just such an essential way to frame this conversation. And my name is Berenice Tompkins, and I am talking to you from Lenape and Wappinger land. So I'm in the Hudson Valley in New York. But I work in New Jersey. I work as the coalition organizer for Jersey Renews Coalition through the New Jersey Work Environment Council. So just for anybody who's not familiar, Work Environment Council is an organization that's existed for about 30 years, working on issues of worker justice and occupational safety, and bringing workers and community and environmental groups together to look at their common interest in addressing climate change, as well as advocating for occupational and environmental safety. And so Work Environment Council has a really long history of convening groups that sometimes exist in silos, unions, community groups, environmental groups. And in 2017, WEC, Work Environment Council, co-founded the Jersey Renews Coalition, which consists of about 60, little bit over 60 labor groups, so unions, faith organizations, and community and social justice organizations, and environmental groups. And we are focused on advocating for good green jobs, so making sure both that union jobs are available in the new green economy, and that there are pathways to green jobs for everyone, that everybody gets to benefit from the transition to a green economy, and also making the connections of how climate change impacts workers as well as communities, and why we all have a stake in tackling the climate crisis. So that's just to give you all a little bit of background on the work that Jersey Renews does. We are state-based, so we are focused in New Jersey primarily, which is of course very close by. So I'm really delighted to be talking about this in a regional context today, because I think that makes a lot of sense, considering that a lot of the problems that we face need to be addressed regionally. And what I want to talk a little bit about today is why we must address climate change as we recover from the COVID-19 pandemic and economic recession, and what that means, and what solutions we can find that will protect folks economically, address climate change, and create good new jobs that are accessible to everyone. How can we find solutions that also holistically address all the crises that we face? Next slide, please. Wonderful. So I wanted to start by talking a little bit about some of the ways that we can see the pandemic and our economic crisis kind of converge with the climate crisis right now. And I know understandably, many of us here in the Northeast have been really, really focused on the immediate economic and health crisis that we face. But in New Jersey, where I work, we did recently experience Tropical Storm Isaias, and that provides a little glimpse specifically into what happens when folks lose power during a pandemic. We had about 1 million people, a little over 1 million people lose power here in New Jersey. And if you are an elderly person, a person who maybe lives alone and who maybe, doesn't have digital access, getting sick and losing power during a pandemic could potentially be a really dangerous combination. So that's for the folks who are most vulnerable to the pandemic, typically elderly people, people with disabilities, people who may live alone, thinking about what it means to not be able to necessarily reach someone to call for help, to lose power or to lose phone service as the result of a storm, a natural disaster. So that's one very close to home example of the way that, we can't necessarily link any one storm to climate change, but we know for sure that storms like Tropical Storm Isaias are becoming a lot more frequent and a lot more normal as a result of climate change becoming a new normal. And so we know that this is something that we can expect more of, is this collision of climate events and pandemics like this one, especially as we know that climate change also makes future pandemics more likely. I also want to share a couple of other examples. So we know that for many people earlier in the spring, we had some pretty severe tornadoes hit the south. And we know that for many people, rebuilding at that time was a real challenge. People had to choose between seeking shelter in these very crowded emergency shelters and breaking social distancing. Maybe some of those people had compromised immune systems, or staying at home and risking being injured or harmed by the storm. And then in addition to that, we know that the rebuilding challenge, that was a real challenge for a lot of folks. So a lot of the supplies that people needed to recover had been bought out. There was also the challenge of social distancing and like, how do we come together as communities and support each other in the midst of a pandemic where we're all being told to stay at home, we're all being told to social distance. I also want to share the example of cooling centers, which this is also a good example of the ways that another way that climate change is a health issue, right? Because we know that a lot of people who may not have air conditioning at home or may not be able to afford their utility bills, we know that those numbers of people are increasing as well right now, rely on cooling centers to cool off in the hot summer months. And if you're someone who has a pre-existing condition, you might be especially vulnerable to heat, right? And so, but what's been going on over the summer in these particularly hot summer months is that cooling centers are having to put caps on the number of people who they can let in because of social distancing constraints. And so what does that mean for people who need cooling centers, who may not be able to access them at this moment of extreme heat, and for folks who may simultaneously have compromised immune systems and be vulnerable to the pandemic, and also not have home air conditioning and really, really need the ability to be able to cool off in order to stay safe from respiratory illness. Then probably, of course, the most recent and I think probably largest on people's minds right now example of this is the California wildfires. So there's actually a lot of different ways that we can see kind of the pandemic and climate change come together in this case, right? But one of them is there's potential that we know that smoke may actually exacerbate COVID-19 risk. It's not, I don't think, proven yet, but it's likely because it's a respiratory illness. And so folks have to keep their windows closed right now, but it's also more than 100-degree heat. It's incredibly hot in California. So again, that poses an additional heat risk from people having to protect themselves from the smoke. And in addition to that, we know that this is a particular danger. Oh, I just lost my spot. I'm sorry, y'all. We know that extreme heat also produces ozone, which is another lung irritant. So that's potentially another way that the fires could be causing additional respiratory issues that could be contributing to COVID-19 risk. This is also, of course, not to mention that if folks are displaced, they may then end up in a position where they aren't able to maintain social distancing. And that can, of course, be a really major risk to getting sick. And one thing that I want to highlight with all of these examples is that the same people who are disproportionately vulnerable to the pandemic and economic crisis are the same people who are also disproportionately vulnerable to climate change. So specifically BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, poor communities, people with disabilities. We can see in all of these examples, I think the cooling shelter example is a really good example of this, right? Because people who may live in housing without air conditioning, who depend on cooling shelters, are also potentially more likely to have pre-existing conditions that make them potentially more exposed to the pandemic. And we can see how all of these things kind of come together as a triple or quadruple whammy in some of these cases. Next slide, please. I also want to talk about how these are issues of worker justice in addition to just general public health, and specifically for our most vulnerable workers who have the fewest protections, which are workers who work outside primarily, right? And I think farm workers are a really great example of this, as well as folks who may work in meat packing, because we've seen the ways that there are inadequate COVID-19 protections. And right now that's also coming together with really extreme heat. And what does it mean to have to wear really heavy protective equipment in really extreme heat? Another example of this is UPS. So UPS workers are more busy than ever before delivering packages, working longer days than ever before. I liked this headline, but they're also having to wear masks all day and other protective equipment. And that adds to the potential heat risk that they may face, as well as just general risk of exhaustion that's coming from the pandemic. And coming from them having to work these extra hours with all this heavy gear on their faces and on their bodies. One other example of this is first responders who are currently out in California and who are doing some of the dirty work of responding to fires, of course also responding to injuries as a result of the fires. And of course we know that their smoke inhalation is a potential risk factor for COVID-19. So as our first responders have to go into smoky places to respond to fires, they may be at additional risk. And of course, in addition to the health risks that come with being a first responder and just coming into contact with so many people at this time. So climate change is an issue of worker justice, just as the pandemic is an issue of worker justice. And we know that these crises need to be addressed together. Next slide, please. Wonderful, thanks so much. So the first thing I really want to emphasize is that one of the things that this shows is we still need to act on climate as we get out of this health crisis and recession. So climate change is intensifying all of these crises. Climate change is a health crisis, is an economic crisis, is an issue of worker justice too. And so it needs to be part of our response to the pandemic and our economic stimulus as well. It can't be siloed from either of those things. And the other thing I really want to emphasize is that we need a robust social safety net and really robust worker protections, because we can see that the same people are disproportionately vulnerable to the pandemic as well as to climate disaster, and are given the least support and protection in response to all of these crises, often have the fewest healthcare resources, the least ability to stay home from work, the least ability to cool off, all of the above. And again, this is Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, essential workers. There's a lot of overlap there, of course. People with disabilities and pre-existing conditions is another example. So we need robust protections that target those who are the most likely to get sick or be harmed by these intersecting calamities that are just whamming people in different ways right now. Next slide, please. So I also want to say that we know that with crisis comes opportunity, right? And I don't like Milton Friedman very much in general, but he did famously say that real change is only possible in moments of crisis, but that it's up to us to define how that change happens. That when a crisis hits, it's opened up for this change to go in many different directions. And we have to be able to seize control over that to ensure that the kind of change that we need is what results from this crisis. And so the Sierra Club released this report it was actually a few months back, called 9 Million Good Jobs. And so looking at how we can build back from the economic crisis to build a healthier economy that leaves no one behind. And specifically looking at how addressing climate change in particular is a really significant opportunity to put people back to work, and specifically to put people back to work in the communities that have been hit the hardest by the pandemic, if we do it right. That's not guaranteed, but that is something that could come about if we really prioritize that. And so not only do we have to address climate change and the pandemic at the same time because it's necessary, but addressing climate change actually provides a tremendous opportunity to stimulate our economic recovery by creating all of these good jobs in renewable energy and efficiency. Another sector that I really want to highlight here is ecosystem restoration and restoration of green space, which has huge potential for job creation and also is, of course, the focus of this panel. I'm talking in a way that's a little bit more zoomed out right now. But in all of these sectors, there's tremendous potential for these massive investments. Another one, of course, is mass transit and transit electrification. And yeah, I encourage folks to check out this report because it's a really, really cool resource of what's possible. And I want to zoom in on just a few more details of what a just and green recovery could actually look like, and what are some specific examples of programs that address climate change and put people back to work and can potentially create safety, create access to green space, create positive health outcomes in the communities that are most impacted by the pandemic and by climate change. And so I think one of the most essential examples of this is transit justice. So the idea that everybody deserves to be able to access good, safe transit. And what that means right now is good, safe public transit. And I know, speaking about New Jersey specifically, one of the things that means in New Jersey is massively expanding service so that people have the ability to, first of all, so that everybody has access to transit and has the ability to get to work safely, but also specifically so that people have the ability to social distance on board. We need to be running more transit than we were before. And investing in safe rideshare programs is another. Specifically, one of our partner organizations at Jersey Renews has an electric rideshare program pilot right now, and that's an example of a program that could be expanded so that more people can share cars in an affordable way and get to work safely. And simultaneously, because it's a ride sharing, because it's electric, we're also addressing climate change. So obviously, we know that we need more public transit to get cars off the streets to address climate change, but also we need more public transit so that people can safely social distance on board. We need it to protect transit workers who are just specifically exposed to COVID at extremely high rates right now. And we also need access to electrified public transit and to electric cars in order to clean up our air, which we know has contributed to COVID-19, specifically in communities. There's been research that shows that in communities that are adjacent to power plants, to other polluting entities, we know that those pollutants have been linked to the virus. And so cleaning up our air by reducing pollution from trucks and cars is particularly in environmental justice communities is super, super, super important. And transit electrification, for example, port adjacent communities are going to be disproportionately exposed to these pollutants. And if we can like electrify vehicles in those communities, is particularly, so that means trucks, that means large vehicles, that's super, super important, in addition to buses, which serve everybody. So transit justice is one really major example of a just green recovery, of one program that can help bring about a just green recovery. Another one that I want to highlight is efficiency programs, which can create, these are a really great example of creation of accessible jobs. One of our partner organizations, ISLES, already has a climate and energy training center called SEAT. So it's called the Center for Environmental and Energy Training. And it specifically seeks to create pathways into the green economy, mostly in the form of efficiency and like whole home remediation, which also can in turn make homes safer from contaminants like lead. So it trains people up, which then also provides people relief from high utility bills in the long term because they're saving money on their electric bills, right? So I think efficiency programs are a wonderful example of like really low hanging fruit for creating green jobs as well. And then generally we want to look at worker protections that take into account the impact of climate change and the impact of having to wear additional protective gear. So one of the solutions on that front that Jersey Renews advocates for is a heat hazard index. And then investment in renewable energy. Specifically, I know in New Jersey, we're really focused on offshore wind, but that has the potential to create tons of union manufacturing jobs. Right now, we're looking at an offshore wind port in New Jersey called the New Jersey Wind Port that will be a manufacturing port. And that's really exciting. And one of the ongoing challenges specifically with creating green jobs in a renewable economy is ensuring that there are pathways into the renewable economy for the workers who need it the most, for the communities that have been hit hardest by the pandemic. And there have been some really exciting strides on that front. So some of the unions that we work with have specific training programs that are designed to bring, for example, formerly incarcerated people into the green economy. There was also recently a new occupational license law passed in New Jersey, which has now meant that for many different kinds of occupational licenses, those offering the licensing are not allowed to ask for specific kinds of documentation, which means that these career pathways can be more accessible to undocumented folks, which that's really huge because we know that the need for jobs for folks who are undocumented, for folks who are formerly incarcerated, for all the communities that have been hit the hardest by this crisis is greatest. And so that's one of the areas that Jersey Renews is focused on now, is working with our environmental and social justice partners to look at how we can make sure that all the advocacy that we're doing includes workforce development and training opportunities. Also, I forgot to mention, I know I keep harping on transit, but transit has also tremendous potential for job creation. And especially if we're making like electric buses regionally here in the US, there's so many reasons why transit is important and why it addresses health, also relates to food access, access to green space, just people's basic ability to move around is so significant. So that's just like a really major part of a just green recovery that I want to emphasize. Yeah, so that's just a little, there's so much more that I could say about what a just green recovery means. But I wanted to just highlight some specific examples of the kinds of policies and programs that can help to create jobs and also put people back to work at the same time, and also create other kinds of safety and health right now. So that's all I have for right now. And if there is time, I'd be really happy to answer a couple questions.
Thank you so much, Berenice. We are going to open up the chat room so folks can post questions there. And as they're doing so, I want to ask a couple of questions of you, myself, as we're waiting for folks to come in. You shared so much incredible information, and it's energizing and it's inspiring, especially as we sit on the precipice of an administrative change in our federal leadership. So before I ask my own question, because one came in first, and this really is more about the participants than it is about the things that are happening in my brain. We have one question about efficiency programs. So efficiency programs, expanding transportation, and improved worker protection are all large and important points. How can we support these on the local level? This question comes from Lucia Ruggiero.
Oops,
You're muted.
there we go. Now I'm unmuted, sorry about that. That's such a good question, Lucia, thanks for asking that. I guess I have a little bit of a follow-up question, which is, where do you live, if you don't mind sharing? Because the answer to that might be slightly different depending on where. I can also just say specifically, Jersey Renews is focused at the state level in New Jersey. So I am most knowledgeable about state level policy in Jersey. But if you're not Jersey based, then I can certainly try and direct you to get resources on that elsewhere.
Bernie, she's in Cumberland County.
Cumberland County? Oh, okay, cool. Okay. So one of the things I can just generally share, one of the things that we've been most focused on right now with Jersey Renews is just ensuring that transit receives funding, and specifically, so I can just share specifically, we want to make sure that New Jersey Transit has a dedicated funding source, because that's the most important step to making everything else we want to happen, including expansion of service, including electrification. And we've also been involved in trying to make sure that the way that TCI is implemented, if folks know what that is, TCI is the Transportation and Climate Initiative. It's regional, and it's a market-based kind of cap and investment program. So it's highly imperfect, but one of the things that we've been trying to ensure is that the way that that's implemented means that New Jersey takes advantage of it for transit funding, and that specifically that it results in meaningful investments and emissions reductions in environmental justice communities. So those are a few things that we're focused on right now, is first of all, ensuring that New Jersey Transit gets funding. And second of all, looking at ways to do that are equitable. So for example, fare hikes can't be a way that we do that right now, because that's going to fall on the backs of working people mostly. And so, yeah, that's just a little bit more about transit in particular, what we're focused on now. And I would just encourage anybody in the audience who's Jersey based, I know my email is here, please feel free to contact me if you're interested in getting involved with Jersey Renews, either if you're part of an organization or if as an individual as well, if you're interested in plugging in as a grassroots activist. There's loads of organizing opportunities right now, specifically around the budget, because that's a really imminent upcoming thing. But also in the long run, putting on the pressure for a just green recovery. Yeah, there's a lot more that I could say about that, but also please feel free to reach out to me. My email is there, and I'm really happy to also answer any of these questions in more detail. I see from Eric, can you speak more about the importance of our community partnering with unions and working to expand the green economy? Yes, definitely. So to me, this is one of the things that made me really excited to work with Jersey Renews, and that I think makes us maybe somewhat unique, though we're certainly not the only one, is this what we would call a blue-green alliance or partnership. We're also the state affiliate of the Blue Green Alliance, for folks who know what that is. So I think this is huge. And so one thing I'll just share as an example is USW, United Steelworkers, is an organization, is actually a member and a steering and founding member of the coalition. And USW represents workers who work in oil and gas. And I think that's pretty amazing because it means that when we talk about what a just transition and equitable transition to a renewable economy looks like, we actually have the direct voices of the workers who are going to be most impacted by that in that conversation. And that's really, really informed the issues that we focus on and the way that we engage in policy work in New Jersey. I think it's so important, and I want there to be more partnerships of this kind and more opportunity for workers' voices to be part of these conversations. Because we have to work together in order to win. We can't be in silos, and we have to acknowledge that we all have a shared interest in creating a fair, sustainable, renewable economy. We can't let ourselves be divided and conquered by like environment versus workers.
Thank you so much, Berenice. I'm going to watch time. There are some good questions here. So what I just offered folks is that we can keep them in the chat, and then maybe there can be a follow-up response for folks so that we can transition over to Benita. You escaped my questions. We're going to go ahead and transition over to Benita. I think that I've got to keep a better eye on time for myself. So Benita, if we could just go ahead and have you introduce yourself and the amazing work that's coming out of the 10-minute walk campaign. Berenice, thank you so much. That was fantastic.
Great. Thanks, everybody. And I'm super excited to be here and can definitely help keep track of time for sure. Berenice and I were talking earlier about this work and how we are both really working in sort of these different areas of sort of community-driven solutions to these large-scale problems, right? Whether it's climate change or whether the challenges of BIPOC communities around health and wellness. And for the 10-minute walk, we are a national effort that's led by the Trust for Public Land, alongside a number of partners that we will mention as we go through, all towards this one idea that parks and green space are an essential community ability and a piece of infrastructure in cities in order to drive the well-being of these communities. So for the rest of this presentation, there's some technical pieces, but what we're really talking about is how can we get cities and residents really involved in changing the landscape of their cities in order to create healthier places to live. Next slide. Thank you. Brief overview of what the 10-minute walk is. Again, sort of tactical, right? How do we get cities to be greener? We do that in this particular case through what we consider a real systems-wide approach. We call this the 100% promise. We would like to bring all residents within urban areas within a 10-minute walk of home by 2050. It's a strong sort of policy side of this where we have mayors and cities that have committed to this idea of the 10-minute walk. We have two other areas of work that we have really invested in, including building a coalition of partners that I just mentioned that we were going to talk about briefly as part of our movement building. And also, how are we actually helping cities themselves advance towards that 100% target? What you see on the screen is sort of a smattering of some of the cities that we have signed on to make pledges towards this large scale commitment. And that is, we have about almost 300 cities, two of which, San Francisco and Boston, have actually already met the 100% target. But a number of other cities on this map, from LA to Memphis to tiny cities, including Winooski, Vermont, who are all very much committed to this idea that greener places are healthier and more climate resilient for their residents. Sorry, I'm getting a bunch of chat pop-ups. Next slide. Do you think it's important for us to talk about, the idea of neighborhood parks? When we talk about the 10-minute walk, we are not talking about just sort of plopping down parks and walking away. We want to ensure that this is not just about proximity. And I should back up and just say, you know, when we talk about 10-minute walk, it is basically another measurement for a half-mile walk. So there's often this tension between whether we're talking about proximity, so it doesn't matter how somebody gets to the park, or quality. And for us, as we, you know, it's a quite nuanced argument that green spaces and nature, natural areas in cities need to be easy to access, and they need to be enjoyable. So when we talk about the campaign at large, we're talking about ways for communities to feel like they can walk or safely get to those parks, whether that's breaking down highways or improving crosswalks, etc. We want these spaces to be inclusive, so folks who are of all different abilities can utilize those park spaces and recreate there safely. We want those spaces to be responsive to what the community needs. So whether it is a largely Latino community, a Latinx community, we want the programming there to be responsive to their needs, etc. And of course, we always want to think about them as having large positive benefits, whether those are economic benefits for the local residents, and certainly the more climate resilient, the better, meaning more tree canopy, greener spaces, thinking about the types of pavement that's being used in those parks. This is in an ideal state. A lot of our cities that we work with can only really financially get to certain parts of the spectrum, but this is in the ideal state as we talk about 10-minute walk proximity. It is also, it's just one piece of the access piece. Next slide. Thank you. So why park access? Again, I sort of glossed over some of these outcomes, but they're actually quite deep, and there's a ton of research out there, some of which has been led by the 10-minute walk, by the Trust for Public Land. And yes, and to answer Olivia's question as a clarifying question, the 10-minute walk metric is the distance for somebody from their home to get to a park. So we want all parks to be within a 10-minute walk of people's homes, meaning real localized neighborhood parks. And so we know that from all of the vast research that is out there, that we're talking about increased health outcomes that are associated with being near green spaces. We're talking about higher academic achievements and social connections, particularly for youth who really need that space. And of course, as we mentioned, definitely positive outcomes around climate resilience, urban heat island mitigation, flooding mitigation, and just overall ability for communities to not bounce back, but sort of cope with the stressors that come along with shocks and stressors, specifically around this current pandemic. So next slide. Whenever you have a chance, great. This work that we have been talking about has been going on. This particular campaign was launched 3 years ago, but none of us in this world, in the parks world, knew that parks and green space would become national news. And of course, it's all against this sort of, terrible backdrop around, folks feeling like, well, the pandemic. So that's not even a feeling, it's sort of mandated, right? That we are all supposed to socially distant. But knowing that, especially in our cities, and especially in areas that has been particularly cut off from parks and green space, this need to get outside and this need to be able to connect with each other was all going to happen in outdoor quality public spaces. When we talk about this movement, really more talking about urban areas, right? Because we're talking about dense areas, there's a lot of concrete, there's a lot of development. How are we going to make sure that people have access to these spaces, particularly in critical times like this? And when we talk about critical times, talking certainly about this current pandemic, but also, as Berenice mentioned, this is a critical time for us to be thinking about these community solutions around climate, as I mentioned. And, in the last 3 months, really thinking more about how these spaces are really important for civic discourse, and ensuring that folks have a place to go to have a social, to both socially connect, but also a place for protest, particularly around this current reckoning on racial injustices. Next slide. So just some really good data. I thought that was really great that Trust for Public Land just put out around why this is particularly important now around the climate piece. A new report came out on urban heat, in which we know now that areas that have neighborhood parks, so basically neighborhoods where residents do have a park within a 10-minute walk of home, are actually cooler by 6 degrees, sometimes more. As we did our analysis, knowing that areas that were primarily BIPOC, actually had smaller parks and green spaces and with less tree canopy. So fewer amenities that had positive benefits, and those that were serving primarily BIPOC communities also were much more crowded, so harder for folks to socially distance. So how are we working with cities to ensure that we can reverse some of these trends, right? We're talking about historically discriminatory land use decisions, as we started this conversation around, that we are all working to reverse. And so through this work, we need to start thinking about how we drive positive benefits to the communities that have long been forgotten. Next slide. So the ways that our team is working on this is, again, we think about this not as a singular organization, but as a whole movement around driving positive benefits to communities. And we think about our work sort of in 4 ways to ensure that those investments that cities are making in parks and green space and natural areas are much more equitably distributed and invested in. So as I mentioned, one of those ways we're doing that is really to elevate this conversation to the mayoral level. We certainly have great relationships with Parks and Rec, very important folks. But when we talk about 100% park access, what we're talking about is transforming all sorts of land use decisions that include transportation, as I mentioned, transportation infrastructure like highways and streets are a very important part of this work. We're talking about working with our sustainability offices in cities. We're talking about economic development and city planning, right? We have to change zoning laws in order for some of this work to happen. And that really starts with getting a high level commitment from the mayor. This picture here is me alongside Mayor Walsh when we hit the 100% park access target a couple of years ago alongside him. And the other 3 areas I'm just diving a little bit deeper into are around the ways that we finance these spaces and the ways that we actually drive funding actually will change the outcomes around both climate solutions as well as parks and green space. We're working with cities on finding more equitably distributed parts of the city to develop into parks and green space. We know that is all under the consideration of the fact that cities are dense, land is expensive. We don't expect cities to just start buying up all the land, particularly when development is also an important part of the solution. And so we need to think creatively about how we find parks and green spaces. And then separately, this shouldn't even be a separate category, but I wanted to call it out, but how do we involve the community in every step of the process? So it's not just about creating a master plan and then asking for community feedback at the end. It is about thinking about how a city is built in ways that are much more responsive to their needs. Next slide. So the first piece is around, we talked about the mayors, now we talk about how we drive equitable investments, and that all starts in our minds with really good data. And when we talk about data, we certainly know that there's technology that helps us map and invest using those maps. So ParkServe is a tool that Trust for Public Land has developed, but we also talk to city planners that really just use Google Earth and really think about how parks and green spaces are distributed in those cities. So ParkServe in particular has mapped about 14,000 metropolitan areas, all down to the microgrid of knowing which parks and green space are within a 10-minute walk of home. So it's about 15,000 cities. And this technology has helped us also splice against demographic data, including age demographics, race demographics, as well as income levels. And we were helping cities optimize what the best bang for their buck will be in terms of developing neighborhood parks in areas that are highest need. But data does not have to be engineered, right? It can come and should come from direct community feedback. So we work also with cities on how are they thinking about how to draw out that community feedback, whether it's through participatory budgeting, whether it is through a much more concerted effort around building neighborhood committees for feedback around their master plans, as well as just localized educational campaigns. Next slide. The financing piece. And I'm sort of zipping through this quickly, even though each of these slides probably could get a 30-minute presentation. So the park investment piece is really important, right? As we know, especially now, as the municipal governments are looking at a $350 billion shortfall due to the pandemic economic downturn, this is going to be much more important than ever. How do we find efficiencies within municipal budgeting? How do we get parks agencies to start pooling their funding, parks agencies and city agencies to pool their funding to help drive these outcomes? So a lot of the ways and how do we ensure that the equity framework sits on top of all of that? So again, we talked about participatory budgeting, involving the community and how to drive that financing. We talked about sort of a little bit about master planning and how it's a very effective way. It can be expensive, but it is an effective way for cities to really think about all of the components that go into driving the growth and the development of their own cities. And folks like Memphis that I mentioned, Orlando, Pittsburgh, have all in their master plans put this 10-minute walk target as a centerpiece because they know it can drive all of these amazing outcomes. And then including the economic outcomes. We could talk about that sort of the strategic look at how cities are looking at driving their financing, but there are all sorts of tactical areas that cities are using. So whether it's using conservancies and land banking, and I think we had a question around how we're leveraging community trust. A lot of cities are investing in land trusts in order to ensure that they're sort of controlling for gentrification, and they're controlling for the driving up of prices that come along often with parks and green space development, where folks are also looking at how to finance using federal grants and federal financing opportunities that include disaster and climate relief programs to help drive money in an equitable form to neighborhoods that most need these parks and green spaces. So a lot of sort of information on this slide, but we're available always after this to talk through how we're working more closely with cities around this. Next slide. This is actually one of my favorite parts of my job, right? Is actually speaking to cities about the ways they really can unlock creative new ways of finding parks and natural areas in their cities. I sort of call folks' attentions to the open streets movement. As we've seen in the last three months, cities have acknowledged the fact that they need more public space, and they needed it quickly, right, in the face of the pandemic, and certainly in the face of the protests. And so folks, cities like Pittsburgh, New York City, Oakland, some of which are, Pittsburgh committed to opening 100 miles of streets within the city. Whether or not some of those streets were equitably distributed or not is all open questions, right? We actually had direct conversations with the city of New York when they were opening their streets, saying that the streets that they were opening were not in the areas that were in the highest 10-minute walk needs. And so that really did guide some of the decision making at the municipal level. But the fact that cities are ready and willing to think creatively about this was a very exciting moment for us. And we also see that in sort of the pop-up parklets movement. Also the ways that restaurants were using outdoor spaces in order to drive their business. And now certainly around outdoor learning, and how are we finding outdoor spaces in order to make sure our children are all being educated and our teachers are all being safe in the current climate. But the area that we think is the most important for all of our cities to explore is really around schoolyards. Schoolyards are in every neighborhood, in every city, essentially. But there are a lot of different issues around how we can work with school districts around opening up those schoolyards and playgrounds for after-hours use and for public use. Obviously, liabilities and maintenance is very important. But if we can unlock that secret, right? And we have been doing that with cities across the country. Oakland is one I just mentioned. 19 million more people could be served with parks and green space. Currently, one data point I did not mention earlier was that currently 100 million people do not have access to a park and green space in this country. And imagine 20 more million people just being served by opening schoolyards to the public. And we know that percentage of access would change if, considerably depending on all sorts of conditions, but some of the cities that is particularly on the West Coast, looking at Inglewood, California, a 40% jump in access for their residents if given the opportunity for schoolyard opening. So there's a lot of sort of legal and technical ways of doing this work, but it is an important area for us to be diving into with our cities. Next slide. And last but not least, we think about, as I mentioned, the way that community can be involved all through the process. I sort of call out a couple of really key examples of the projects that we are partnering with or sort of taking as important examples for all of our cities to be looking into. One is the 11th Street Bridge Park. I think folks from the DC and Maryland area know it well, but it is the bridge that they are hoping to build, a park they're hoping to build across the Anacostia Bridge and into Anacostia, and areas that very, very much exposed to possibilities of displacement and gentrification. And there's been a really, really strong sort of effort, even before any ground gets broken or planned, right, to make sure that the Anacostia residents are deeply involved in the planning, the financing, and the maintenance of that particular park. And that includes talking about home ownership and budgeting, workforce development. How are the communities going to reap the benefits of parks at this scale? And it's been about 2-3 years of work at this point, and ground has not even broken yet, right? So we are just very excited about continuing to learn lessons from the 11th Street Bridge Park. But there's all sorts of ways of involving communities, even at the sort of ground level, including how are we allowing folks to enjoy these spaces for cultural purposes? How are they using these spaces for their own arts expression and cultural expressions and celebrations? I mean, there's a lot of work within this area as well, but we do think it's it's an important seed as we think about the equity piece of all of our work. Next slide. And just wanted to give a shout out to all of our partners, and this list is growing, but this is the ways that we know that the Trust for Public Lands cannot do this work alone, as I mentioned, and we know that we need to work across sectors, as I mentioned earlier. And so have been just very excited to drive the technical expertise from our partner organizations, including Urban Land Institute, who are real estate developers, all the way to the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, who are climate advisors, right? How are we all changing this conversation from just being about parks to being around driving new benefits to communities across the country and at a national scale through this one particular type of work? So just wanted to give a quick shout out there. And next slide. Yeah, so super excited about sort of taking questions now or after the presentation. There's, again, a lot of information in this slide, but I really think it's, as we talk about this work, I, again, feel like very, very akin to what Berenice is saying, is that this is really the time for us to be talking about this work. And we just know that, there's been a lot of while we are about to face a crisis around budgeting, a lot of political will from the mayors that we work with, and that we're very thrilled by. So we're going to just keep on driving forward in the next 6 to 12 months. So thank you. Happy to take questions.
That's awesome. We're kind of stuck a little bit. We have, I think, maybe 30 seconds left in in our time. It's one of the lessons that we learn all the time is an hour is just never ever enough, especially when you have such powerful initiatives coming out from these great leaders. I know, again, I have a ton of questions. I see that we've got a wonderful list of questions here, so maybe I'll try to just grab one real quick, Benita, and that is around our rural communities. Oftentimes, most of my work is in the urban space, and I know that we've got members in the rural communities that were saying, what about us? Why are we so focused on the cities? So is there anything that you can say about parks in the rural areas? And then I know you have to hop off.
Yeah, thank you. This is an ongoing conversation, and it is the 10-minute walk metric itself was born of sort of from dense urban areas, specifically New York City and Pittsburgh really advanced that metric as a really important one for parks and green space. And so that's the place that we grow from, because we know that walkability is much more of the essence of dense urban areas. However, we are constantly in conversation of what would be the most inclusive, equitable target for rural communities. We can't expect a rural community to build walkable neighborhoods in an instant. So we think about that often, but right now the metric is really around urban dense areas.
Awesome. We are at time. The contact information is in the chat box. If you want to reach out to Berenice or Benita, you can reach out to me if you'd love to. But I haven't shared anything with you, but I'm happy to talk to you about anything. I invite you to go to policylink.org to learn a little bit more about that organization if you're not already familiar with the great work that's coming out of my shop as well. So many thanks. Everybody stay safe, hold your loved ones close, and we appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. I just want to remind you that the next breakout session starts at 11:30, and you can access all the Zoom links on sketch.com.